Wind tears sting her eyes and taste of salt, the bridge wing slick and gleaming, the horizon a sawtooth of gray-green ridges shouldering east, and Petty Officer Maeve O'Rourke keeps her 750s moving in measured arcs. 10-degree sector, count to 30, shift, repeat. The routine is a lullaby that must not seduce. The sea state is 4, 6 to 8 feet, spray combing the crests, and the overcast above is a broken ceiling with rents that drift and heal like old wounds. She squints at the smear of haze west-southwest, blinks hard as the wind needles her lids, and finds, impossible tiny, a pinprick of silver that needles back before winking out. The rhythm of the swells swallows it, but the image hangs like a needle in her mind, vibrating. She doesn't shout. She doesn't trust her throat. She plants boots to the deck, wrenches her pelvis toward the Polaris, and sings out a bearing in a voice steadier than her pulse. Bearing 279, faint glint, repeat, 279. The words whip off the bridge wing and into the voice tube, and Lieutenant Commander Arthur Hale, XO and Gunnery ASDIC officer, takes 2 strides to the compass repeater and rakes a grease pencil across its rim. He's been riding the edge between fatigue and adrenaline for hours, sunbreak stabbing his eyes like tacks, and he wants to say, not again. He says, mark instead, and the plotter echoes it and draws a thin line toward a dot that is not yet real. If he calls wrong, he opens a gap in the screen and spends charges. If he hesitates, a torpedo might already be on the way. Noise blooms across the water. Gulls, the low, muscular thrumming of the convoy's center lane, the hiss of spray being torn into wind. Hale squints into his own 7 Title 50s and sees waves pretending to be things, sees cloud shadows laying false ridges across the swell, sees every lying flash born of whitecap and sun. The bearing on his grease line tethers him, something narrow to bet on. He asks for a repeat bearing at 15-second intervals and hears Maeve's voice tick off numbers that do not drift much. And that is the only steadiness he trusts. He says, steady on current course, be prepared to alter 10 to port, and doesn't yet say what they're altering for. The weather does its tricks. The overcast opens a throat for the sun, a shaft of light angled like a rapier, and it traverses the sea in slow motion. For 3 seconds, every crest catches fire, each a coin flicked by a giant hand. In that glare, the only certainty is nausea. The lookout's job is to separate one truth from a million glittering lies, and this kind of light is designed to make men doubt. Maeve blinks into the assault and lets the water roll from her lashes, counting because counting gives the mind a rhythm that resists panic. On the count of 3, the shaft closes, light collapses, and the sea returns to shades of iron. No mercy, no sparkle. The void where the glitter was is, perversely, clearer. Up scope, 2 seconds, says Neumann, and the interior of U slips into a different kind of light. Yellowed lamps, condensation pearls along steel like sweat on a body. The Type VII shivers with the sweet sting of cold Atlantic brine where it wicks through the periscope well. The watch officer's hand is a clamp on the scope's handle, knuckles pale, eyes pinched. He trusts the clouds to hold, trusts the broken sky not to throw a blade down the throat of the sea at the wrong instant. He trusts that the chipped paint ring from January ice in the Barents, one careless bump on a floe, doesn't matter. He trusts too many things that have nothing to do with knots or bearings. Chief Hans Ritter, chief engineer, stands half-crouched near the motor controls, shoulders braced as the boat heaves faintly in the swell, even at periscope depth. The battery meters glow a red that is too honest. 52% after a hungry night, and that is generous. The gauges lie a little in their optimism, the way men lie to wives about cigarettes. Pumps are throttled back to a near silence, one fan moaning instead of 3, air thickening with spent breath and machine heat. He has men moving like librarians, careful not to brush steel with steel, Silence protocol drilled into muscle memory and fear. He thinks about hours as breath, not minutes. He thinks about how many exhales they can afford. Haley's world is angles and lines and the music of bearings repeated. He scratches another slender mark on the compass rim, almost touching the first, and feels the small joy of consistency, a soldier's pleasure in a boot that fits. Grease line 279 holds, the plotter murmurs, eyes on his chart that the ocean will not respect. The Convoy, 8 knots spread across the horizon's imagination, shifts under orders no one on Hale's deck hears, altering 10 degrees to avoid a patch of mines reported by aircraft that may or may not exist. Relative motion stretches the geometry until it looks like voodoo. His line may drift, and not because the sea has lied, but because the ships he protects have taken a safer curve. Scope, Neumann murmurs to himself as much as to the man at the hydraulics. The column rises with an oily grace, breaks the skin of the Atlantic as if kissing it, and shows a head almost no larger than a man's closed fist. The ring of paint around that small brass brain is nicked, bright metal exposed like tooth enamel, and that taste of light it can catch is pure danger. He has promised himself 2 seconds and intends to keep the promise. The eyepiece is a cold mark around his brow. The world outside slides into a tight circle, a belt of gray and white and moving hulls at the boundary. There, mass low and black and foaming, a destroyer's breath. He starts to count. Maeve hasn't moved her boots since the first call because moving means changing the lens of her nerves, and she is not done with this lens. The shaft of sun returns, but not as savage. It is filtered by a thinner cloud, a polite visitor. The flash she can accept now will look like a plan and not an accident. The swells roll under her, and the deck under the swells, and a blink takes the grit from her eye just as the sea's skin becomes a mirror again. The pinprick returns. It is slower, languid in its brightening, and a beat of it seems to crawl along something that cuts the water with exquisite selfishness. A point of light that moves not like a wave, but like a man's hand. "Repeat bearing," Hale calls, and the answer, 279, steady, comes like a drumbeat. He draws a third line that lies down over its brothers and understands that the universe has offered him an improbable courtesy, a signal that repeats on demand in the worst possible conditions. He wants to deliver a small homily to the gods of war about mercy coming in pinpoints. "Helm, prepare to alter to 279. Wait for mark," he says, and the helmsman's knuckles bulge like ropes. The action station's klaxon has not barked because Hale refuses to spend everything on a sparkle. He wants one more thing. The U-boat's focus is as narrow as the scope's circle, and Neumann's breath is too loud in his own ears. He whispers 1, and the men nearest him, though trained not to flinch, lower their chins as if the number itself might make a noise. The periscope head pulls in a thin necklace of water as the sea's skin rejects it, and that is a wake of a kind, a feather drawn with a pencil too sharp for human sight. Neumann's eye bounces between points, a habit born of training and sleeplessness. He looks at the hull that must be an escort, the smudge of smoke that must be the convoy's heart, the empty quadrants that might conceal hawks. 2 seconds is a luxury he cannot truly afford. He takes 3. Ritter feels the scope move down as much as hears it, a sigh in the steel of the boat, and counts his own numbers. Amp draw here, circuit load there. He dials back the trim pump a shade more, lets water seek its own level in tired tanks, and hears the whisper of men's lungs, filling the silence the machines won't. It is a choice he will pay for with CO2 later, but later is a gift not yet earned. He keeps a finger on the battery's pulse and a toe on the brake. Maeve takes her cheek from the binoculars and knows the feel of wind on wet eyelids means she will cry for no reason for the next hour. She sucks a breath to dry her eyes and plants the glass again. There is a discipline to horizon work that has nothing to do with bravery. It is a contract with boredom and pain. The Silver had a law to it, a repeatability that separates it from the panic of a splash. She trusts repeatable things. Same bearing, she says without being asked, and because that is so, it matters. As Dick reports interference, someone below bleats into a handset, and Hale grimaces. Type 144 is supposed to be their conscience in conditions like this, but temperature layering has carved the ocean into panes of glass, each reflecting sound in wicked ways. Their own wake stirs bubbles into a froth that scatters the pings into confetti. He has a scope of a different kind, a cathode ray twitching on green, and it is not to be trusted now. "Hold off on the set," he says to the sonar hut, and commits not to wait for an electronic voice to bless the thing the human eye has seen. Sometimes certainty costs more than the time you have. He thinks in patterns not just of sound, but of light and sea. Sun breaks in this latitude and with this cloud deck run 3 to 5 seconds before the ceiling stitches shut. If a periscope exposes itself to confirm bearing, a man on that steel tube will time his peaks to those windows. If those windows walk across the sea at a pace set by wind and cloud, the repetition of glints will have a rhythm that tells you about a human decision and not a wave's comedy. "Watch your timing," he says to Maeve, without making it sound like anything but love. Neumann drops the scope, and the world narrows in another way. The boat is now a closed loop of air, sweat, and decisions. He tells the captain, a shape in the gloom, "Convoy bearing 279, center mass. One escort left flank, closing. Recommend quarter turn to starboard to gain parallel. Night attack window favorable if we maintain position." He does not say, "We have been seen." He does not say it because to say it is to make it true. The captain says nothing for account of his own, then. "We remain at periscope depth for contact. If they have not seen us, we are ghosts. If they have, we will know." He lets silence be his bravado. Ritter hears this second-hand, the way news travels in a long steel tube, and thinks how ghosts run on batteries that are old men now. He trims for a slightly deeper belly, the boat settling as if to sleep, and opens a valve the width of his thumb a fraction to adjust. On the destroyer, Hale finds that the place where a glint was is now a question mark and a dare. He lifts his whistle to his lips and considers waking 100 men to fight a reflection. He earns his pay in the space where caution and courage meet and brawl. He settles for standby action stations, a halfway alarm that tenses muscles and hearts without dropping charges into the sea as prayer beads. The intercom squeals, and a bosun's pipe chases men to their places. The destroyer herself hears in a way. Her bow rises into a heavier swell as if flexing. Spray slices across the bow and up into the bridge, a white sheet that freezes in the air as a sculpture for a heartbeat before gravity steals it. Men swallow salt and swear at the sky they cannot punch. Maeve's arm is wet to the elbow and her coat heavy. She keeps the glass steady by force of stubbornness and anger. "Bearing holds," she says into the noise, and Hale believes her because no machine can say that with her grit. A cloud seam opens again, narrower, a hole you could shove a paper knife through, and the water below it becomes more reflective than seawater ought to be. A polished belt. In that belt, a thing cuts not like a wave, but like a blade. A thin head, a smooth slicing, and a bead of light that rolls along metal like mercury. No wave has seams or beads. No wave leaves a straight, unnatural line drawn off its passage. The head dips, and the bead of light runs off the brass and drops into the water as if the sea would take it back. Maeve knows what a wake should look like. The ocean writes in cursive, foam scribbles and curls. This line is straight and temporary, a chalk mark on slate that the next swell will erase. It is a thing that happens only when something unnatural parting the water moves too cleanly to be a fish or a log. That feathered line, narrow and transgressive, points where eyes want to go in the same way a rifle barrel points where hands want to send a bullet. She drags her voice through salt and says, "Feather, feather on 279, straight line, pointing." Hale's heart does something stupid and human. It believes. He slashes a thicker grease mark through the 3 quiet lines on his repeater, the pencil leaving a black smear that feels like a contract signature. "Helm, come left to 279, ahead 2/3, he says, the words a small war. "All stations, action stations, this is not an exercise." The klaxon barks, a depth and volume that seems to crack the sky. Men sprint where they have been standing still and say the same prayers they said last time. Deep in the U-boat, the air seems to lose half its taste. Neumann has that prickle at the base of his skull that precedes a fall. He tastes the humid metal of the scope handle on his fingers and wishes for a night that is hours away. "Scope up, 1 second, he says to a sailor whose eyes are wiser than his years, and the boy's hands are gentle with the lever. The head breaks the skin and kisses the sunbeam's edge for the barest part of a breath. Neumann sees the destroyer turn. There is the proof, a hull changing its heartbeat for him, and he understands that neutrality is a luxury gone. The hydraulic sigh of the scope going down seems loud enough to be heard in Ireland. Ritter takes his own breath in stages to quiet it. He calculates because sums comfort him. At 3 to 4 knots underwater, on batteries at half-life, they have an hour of running before his dials go from honest to screaming. That hour must harvest a darkness that is not here yet. He kills a fan that is making a bearing whine, and hears the air get thicker for it. He tells a machinist to sit on his hands. Hale feels the ship tilt under him as the helm answers, the bow knifing a little more hungrily into the next swell. He will fight the urge to throw the throttle to full. A sprint burns a circle in the water you then have to recross to reacquire. He wants to keep the line of bearing pure on the plot, to let motion be information and not noise. "Plot mark every 15 seconds, bridge, report drift," he says. His voice is a saw cutting. Maeve reports, the numbers a cadence that becomes its own map. The gray horizon, shaved by intermittent haze, refuses to give her a hull, a mast, a flag. It gives her a liar's jewelry box of glints and sparkles, and she throws each back into the sea in her mind, keeping only the one that returns. A swell taller than the rest lifts the destroyer and her view with it, and for a heartbeat she sees a shadow of a conning tower shape beneath the surface that may be no more than a religion of patterns in her skull. She breathes slow because breath is the only thing she can control. Sun breaks play hopscotch with the ocean, each square a coin of time. The glint they hunt appears in them with a discipline that suggests orders. It is there in the first, absent in the dark, present again in the next, which means a man is deciding, which means a man can be killed or kill. Hale draws not just a bearing line, but a timeline in his head, mapping the rhythm of exposure to the rhythm of light. This is how you turn a speck into a trackable thing. You mate it to the sea's metronome and listen for a human beat underneath. Neumann reads the swell as scripture, counts the period between crests and motions his periscope with that time so that his head breaks the least of it. He times his exposures to the cloud holes because he believes a sun flash cannot be distinguished from white water by men who do not want to see. He believes many things that were true yesterday. He takes 1 more second than he should, because every second buys him a lasting image with which to draw lines later on a chart that will be judged by men with wider shoulders. Ritter, sensing the boat's posture change with each nibble of scope, takes weight aft a fraction, the ballast like a chest being filled. The boat's skin is cold to the touch, but inside, sweat beads, and runs on bare arms and cheeks. A sailor stifles a cough with a cloth that already smells of other coughs. The air recirculation is minimized until the machine sits like a held breath. He feels time, real time, a thing with weight, gathering on his shoulders. Spray over the destroyer's bow increases as the Beaufort climbs a notch, the rising wind throwing more brine into the air and over optics. Glasses are wiped with sleeves already wet. The bridge deck is a skating rink. Memory becomes part of the fight. Maeve keeps the bearing in her head when the sea smashes her view to white, holds the line through blindness, retrieves it when she can see again. A lost minute now would widen the error cone until their enemy could walk through it and away. Hale knows he is asking his people to do arithmetic in a hurricane. Aztec hums uselessly below. The thermocline out here is a trickster at around 200 feet, bending sound down and up like a child with a magnifying glass. If the U-boat sits beneath, even a good set will lie. He is committed on sight. There is a fear in that, and a thrill that embarrasses him. He is not supposed to be thrilled by hunting, a line his mind whispers as he rests his thumb on a button that will send men and explosives roaring toward a guess. Neumann watches the destroyer's bow lift and cut, the rhythm of her movement syncing with his own boat's sway. He imagines their lines crossing in time and space and chooses to assume victory. Overconfidence is not a word a man uses in his own head. He thinks, "We have been careful, we have been lucky. The clouds are our allies, and this escort's eyes are half-blind with glare." He thinks this as he orders, softly, "Down periscope," and adds, almost as an afterthought, "Maintain," as if the sea will respond to his modesty. The next sun shaft knifes down, thin and mean, and the periscope head, raised a hair, longer than the last time because men are built to be greedy, obliges the light. The beat of Mercury runs its track again, undeniable as a second heartbeat. Maeve doesn't need numbers to know what that means, but she gives them anyway because a ship runs on numbers said out loud. 279, repeat confirmed, she says, the word confirmed heavier than anything else she has said today. Across the distance, as fast as a thought, but made of light and water, a feather of wake traces a ruler's straight line that no swell disturbs, a brief pale hair on the Atlantic skull pointing dead at the fat, slow heart of the Convoy. It lingers 10 seconds where no wave should, and then it is gone, erased not by mercy, but by time. The destroyer answers her helm into the mark. The sea holds its breath. Hale doesn't wait for a second opinion. He's already sweeping his grease pencil across the repeater, locking the bearing in his mind as the destroyer's helm answers with a starboard bite that sends spray fanning off the bow. "Mark!" he snaps, and the plotter repeats the numbers into the red-lit chart room with a steady voice that belies the sudden pivot of the deck, because a straight line toward a ghost demands the certainty of a ruled edge, not a wish. The engine telegraphs clang to full ahead, brass fists knocking the bulkheads with a familiar urgency, and the hull's long bones shiver as the bow digs into the gray-green. 8 knots becomes 15, then 20, and the destroyer shoulders through the swell, launching jets of white spray that shear away and return as glittering mist. Maeve O'Rourke braces a boot against the combing, the 7 Engate 50 binoculars tight to her face, fighting wind tears that keep trying to erase what she thinks she saw, because a blink now could widen the uncertainty to an ocean. Glare comes in pulses as the overcast shreds and mends, a celestial shutter clicking on and off, and with each burst the sea scatters false stars across whitecaps. Hale orders the bridge lookouts to split the sector into 10-degree arcs, timed sweeps every 30 seconds, because pattern is the only defense against the sea's talent for lying, and he carries the bearing forward with annotated marks that start to build a story on the glass. Down and ahead, under that broken light, Neumann flattens his palm and cuts the scope. Tiefenruder 2 Meter ab. The periscope head slips beneath a chop with a last silver blink, rolling like mercury along a chipped paint ring that he has meant to sand since ice scarred it near Trondheim. He knows 2 seconds can be a lifetime for a glint, and he curses his own confidence, because the ocean is full of eyes when the clouds lift. Chief Ritter feels the order as a tremor in the boat, the subtle change in trim that tells him the watch officer's peering has ended. He dials back pumps until their hum is a memory and leans toward the battery panel, the needle visiting 52% like a tired guest. It will not stay. Air grows heavy even when no one breathes loud, and he thinks in minutes at 3 knots, 60, maybe 90 before the world gets small and the men's lungs become clocks. So any sprint is a wager they cannot pay for long. Asdic's room is a low-lit cave with a green soul. The operator's hand hovers over the gain, eyes locked on a trace that is mostly sea. Type 144 coughs back a smear through the ship's own wake, then nothing, then a half-hopeful twitch that could be layer-scattered plankton. Hale leans over the set, listening more than watching, because layers bend sound like heat bends air, and up here, in wind and glare, he will have to captain by symmetry. A bearing, a feather, a gut decision that they are not chasing a mirage. The convoy astern alters course 10 degrees on the Commodore's signal, a slow swerve of the entire stitched-together procession that pulls its smoke toward the west. Hale knows the geometry flips when the convoy changes. That relative motion shifts the intercept solution under his feet. He calls for the signal bridge to relay his intent to the other escorts in short flags and clipped wireless. A destroyer sprinting out of the screen makes a gap as much as it makes a threat, so they must drag the net with them, or a wolf will find the hole. Maeve forces herself to breathe in counts, keeping the glass steady as the ship rides up a swell and hangs for a long heartbeat at the top, horizon stretched flat and far. There is a cleanliness to that line that is the opposite of the sea's usual mess. If anything spears it, anything at all, it will be wrong. She starts her sweep left to right through her designated 10 degrees, the internal metronome ticking, and the spray that arcs from the bow in cold whips tries to take her balance, but the thought of missing that spear point keeps her braced and stubborn. Under, Neumann listens with his shoulders, measuring the destroyer's sprint through the water by the pitch of its screws, high and quick, closing the distance with a predator's confidence. He keeps the periscope down and calls for a 3-degree helm change that will slide the boat across its previous line, just enough to test whether the hunters are looking at a smear or a path. Too much, and he sketches a wake the sea will remember. Too little, and he offers himself up along a straight answer to a straight challenge. Ritter hears the small sigh of water as planes bite and the stern adjusts, and he flexes his hands over valves he won't touch unless he must. The men have gone still the way only men submerged can go still, spines pressed to steel, breath rationed by habit, as condensation gathers on bulkheads and makes slow decisions to fall. He kills the auxiliary blower despite the rising stale weight to the air, because the boat's life is measured in electrons and again in silence. Today, one feeds the other. Hale tastes the moment when you commit to vision. There is high science below decks, and there is a line on a glass above, and sometimes the line must carry the heavier truth. He calls for action stations. The klaxon's bark is answered by boots thudding into positions and red safety pins being pulled and checked for depth charge settings. 50, 100, 150 feet with fuses staggered 5 to 7 seconds apart. He knows the first pattern will be a test more than a kill, a punch into shadow to make the shadow move. The wind freshens, Beaufort 4 pushing to the high side, and the sea begins to reload the bow faster than the deck crew can wipe their eyes clear. Spray rides up in sheets that turn the bridge windows into temporary mirrors, throwing back ghost images of the men watching the world, and each mirror steals a second. Maeve keeps calling cuts on the bearing in a voice that has edges of cold and tension. 087, 086, holding. And the plotter builds a nest of converging thin lines that argue her case to anyone who doubts. Neumann risks the scope once more, because if the convoy shifts again, their nighttime lattice will be wrong. Off! The head spears the surface between swells like a stitch through cloth, water streaming down in glass threads, and in the 3 seconds he dares, he sees the escort's blade bow turning toward him, the white dog teeth of its wake bright under a sudden sun. He fouls the scope deliberately with a small oscillation, hoping to smear his feather, but the damage to the paint betrays him with a tighter, meaner glint that rides the edge like a bead. Ritter counts to 4 with him and feels the slight uptick as the motor field loads to heave the mast up and back. He shifts a ballast whisper to keep the boat from porpoising, suspects a thermal layer around 200 feet, by the way the screw noise above comes and goes in a slow, breathing way. If they can sit just under it, he thinks, the sound will bend and the hunters will overrun them. But to get there means a drain they cannot refill today, and the air will get heavy enough to make the men taste iron and copper. On the destroyer's ass-stick, the operator winces as his baseline smears with the ship's own turbulence. Type 147 tries to ride the transducer's tilt to keep a bottom beam, but the layer is a trickster, returns kink, and return to mush. He calls a faint echo to port that lasts half a heartbeat, bears almost exactly along the line, in grease on the bridge. Hale's hand wraps the railing and he nods once to no one, because 2 different senses agreeing is a luxury he doesn't expect and won't get again in the next 5 minutes. Hale orders the first depth charge run with a calm that is not calm at all. Pattern Baker, short, and the crews at the K-guns snap in and swivel, the racks shuttling their squat cylinders into launch. He knows the charges will fall short and shallow by design. They are feeling the outer skin of a shape they cannot yet draw, and the trick is to make that shape flinch, to push it into a place where sound will find it, or fear will force a mistake. A destroyer kills as much by what it suggests as by what it explodes. Maeve keeps the bearing chant like a rosary, eyes burning, wind stinging, because the voices around her need a cadence. 086, 085, steady. She watches the place the feather was and sees now only ordinary water, and learns the most dangerous thing about a wake like that. It invites you to doubt where it pointed once it's gone. Hale's second grease line is a ghost of the first, and they are beginning to blur into an arrow that points at a moving nothing, which is somehow more convincing than something. Under the wave skin, Neumann has the helmsman bring the boat to a quiet 3 knots. Every turn of the screws, a soft, chewed sound he prays doesn't clip the edge of the layer and sing upward. He holds the last image of the destroyer in his mind, its spoilers of spray and the way it cut the swell. He knows its class by that and guesses its weapons by the attitude of its approach. He considers turning hard to put them abeam and then away, but the thought of the noise the rudder would throw makes him discard it. Small angles now, patience now, air later. Ritter feels the CO2 scrubbers working at half and is already planning to ratchet them down again if the situation demands absolute silence. He thinks of the last time he watched men's thinking slow as the balance in the battery box and in the blood shifted, how conversation became replaced by nods and fingers, and he prepares to ration even nods. He chases a drip down a conduit with his eyes until it falls, and the small sound of it landing seems like hammer on anvil, ridiculous and loud. Depth charges leave the K-guns in a sequence that feels both inevitable and theatrical, their stubby bodies hopping into the air with red safety pins trailing like tongues. The racks kick their last 2 over the transom, and for a suspended second they are almost pretty. Then gravity reasserts, and they roll into the slate water with hardly a splash. The men above know the violence is to come, The men below know the time between water entry and detonation better than their own names, and both groups mark different beats on the same drum. Hale's eyes never leave the bearing as he counts the seconds to himself, and the world starts to breathe deeper to make room for the explosions. When they come, 5, then 7 seconds apart, the sea erupts in slate fists that boom through the hull like arguments you can't ignore, and the destroyer's stern steps sideways out of its own wake. He watches the froth settle and tells himself he's not looking for oil or wreckage. Not yet. He's looking for movement, for a new feather somewhere, a hair off the lines he's drawn. In the U-boat, concussions arrive as pressure more than sound, each one a hand pushing the boat down a fraction, each one an order to every organ to tighten. A lamp flickers as the battery is asked to be both heart and shield, the dimness returning in waves like a tide rolling through steel. Men count in whispers. Counting is a way to hear something other than the next explosion. Ritter counts amperage drops and rebuilds the numbers as myths that end in survival, because numbers are gods here if you pray right. Neumann reads the pattern as if tilted on a chart, shallow, then a shade deeper, then deeper still, a ladder being put down in the water for him to climb under. He takes the hint and orders a quiet descent, past 180 toward 220, hunting a layer he cannot see but that his skin believes in. The water gets cooler against the steel, sound turns thick and slow, and he hopes the destroyer's ears will skip like a stone at this boundary if he can get just beneath it without scrawling his presence with bubbles. Aztec shrugs off the last of the pattern's self-noise and goes back to a starved diet. Sea and the ship's wake, the occasional tick that is nothing. Hale doesn't move to recircle yet. To turn early is to admit he's lost the line. To turn late is to ride the wrong vector into empty water. He weighs the convoy behind him, the gap he has left, and the faith that the other escorts are now slotting in to watch his open door, and decides on one more straight run that extends his arrow out beyond comfort, because second guesses make corpses. Maeve lowers her glass for 1 second to claw drizzle out of her eyes, just one, and feels the old superstition prick at her. What if that second is the one? She brings them up again and drags the world into focus along 085 and sees only gray cathedrals of water lifting and falling. But she doesn't let the despair in because she can still feel that beat of light she saw earlier, like an afterimage. Afterimages can be promises if you've drawn the lines to meet them. Ritter makes the quiet turn under the thermal, a whisper of helm that never gets near cavitation, and the crew feels it as a tilt that takes a decade. He lets the bilge pump stay dead, even as he feels, deep in his engineer's bones, the itch to make the boat cleaner and truer. But the pump will chatter just enough to send a telltale note up the column of water that might not come back as much to them as to the ears drawing lines out there. And silence has to be absolute if it's going to be an answer. Hale picks out a low trough ahead where the sun is about to break through a high tear in the cloud, and he tells Maeve, not looking at her, "Watch into the light, ignore the glare, find the thing that holds still." It's terrible advice and exactly right, because waves love to move, but a periscope's logic is persistence. Even dipping, it rides a plan, and anything that persists with purpose under this fickle sky will betray itself if you set your eye for it. Under the glancing sun, as if summoned by that thought, a point lands again, a tiny bead that gleams and then humbles itself back into water, no larger than a coin at arm's length and no longer there than a blink. It lies almost exactly on the bearing that Maeve has been reciting into her own skull for the last 5 minutes, and the difference, if any, is within a degree, which no wave earns, because waves have rhythm without north, and this thing is a compass in miniature. She hears herself say, "There," but her voice is already halfway into the numbers. 085.5, steady. And the plotter's pencil slashes across the glass with relief and fear married in the same stroke. Hale doesn't smile. He marks it and orders the helm to hold the line like scripture, because two lights have become a line, and a line is a path, and a path is something you can drive ordnance down with a purpose. He feels the decision harden into something that will carry them out of the fog of maybe and into the mathematics of murder. Neumann closes his eyes in the green half-dark and sees, with a phantom vision that is not eyes, the arc he has made under the layer and the swift thing above lining itself with the smear he failed to smear enough. He knows they will throw again, that the next pattern will be deeper and wider, and he whispers to the helmsman to hold the rudder in the fractions, let the boat become quiet under its tilt, because turning hard now will scribe a new wake, and turning not at all will let the arrow find its center. Perhaps somewhere between is a slither that strips their attention without saying why. Dick stutters as the destroyer's bow mounts the next swell, and the transducer's view warps under a slab of turbulence. Then, as the ship pitches down, the set kisses a cleaner band of water for a heartbeat, and the scope shows a single narrow spike that doesn't fit the chaos around it. The operator calls it, short, careful, as if saying a fragile truth out loud could break it. And Hale triangulates the faint with the bright, building a ghost with edges, readying himself to swap from depth charge theater to hedgehog geometry if the next tick repeats. Behind them, the convoy lines hold even as the course change continues to snake through the columns like a rumor, freighters adjusting with the infinite caution of men who know how little separates steel from the deep. Hale knows that every minute here is a minute where the gap he opened might invite a second wolf to glance in and see an unguarded fat ship rolling alone. He trusts the other destroyer captain who slid into his space because trust is the currency of screens, and without it, everything breaks into solo fights. No one wins. Maeve drags a sleeve across her mouth and sets her stance again, because the destroyer's sprint is a long knife duel with the same target, and fatigue is the enemy that can get you from your own side. She splits her next sweep into smaller slices, not daring to leave the center long, because the last glint came in the trough and the next might be on the rise, and she understands now why the old hands talk about periscopes as if they're alive. They have habits, and habits are how you kill living things. Ritter puts a palm against the hull and feels the song of steel at speed above. He wonders if their chipped ring is the bead that wrote their doom in 2 pinpricks of stolen sun. He thinks about a rare day with a paint pot and a scraper that never came, and he shakes the thought off like a man shakes off a superstition he both believes and hates, because regrets are as loud in the mind as pumps are in a silent boat, and both can carry up if you let them. Hale calls out to the depth charge crews to stand by, but not commit. The next punch is not a punch, but a scatter of teeth thrown ahead, the hedgehog that asks for a position instead of a suspicion, and he will not fire it unless his sums and his senses stack together like cards without gaps. He can feel fatigue trying to turn his head a fraction off the truth, the glare trying to bleach his judgment, and he clamps down, because at this speed there is only the line and the next heartbeat where it might flare. The destroyer knifes into another crest, the deck lifting, the world turning white and then green, and in that green-walled corridor the sun reaches down through a rent and touches the sea like a fingertip. Maeve's eyes, raw and defiant, catch the thread of light wrapping the periscope's injured ring again, a confirmation as tight as a whispered prayer, landing on her bearing so precisely she could thread it into the grease mark with a needle. And she doesn't breathe to call it, because her voice might shake the numbers out of place. A second glint on the same line walks along the water and goes out, leaving behind in her head the straightness of intent. And Hale hears the call anyway, in the way the air changes around his crew, the way shoulders draw up and hands find their jobs without words. He leans into the compass repeater with a hunter's stillness, seeing not the blinding sun break now, but the shadow it casts on the geometry he's built. And he raises a hand, preparatory, because no wave does that twice, and no wave plans its steps to match your marks. Hale's hand does not quite cut the air. It presses it, a palm flattening the moment into command. Engines answer before the words fully form, telegraphs shoved to full ahead, the destroyer's bow biting deeper into the gray, sending sheets of spray like torn film through the sun and shadow. The bridge plot gains another thin graphite vein, the greased pencil scudding over plastic as the plotter repeats bearing numbers in a cadence that is both prayer and metronome. The horizon is a smear of possibility and glare, but the numbers march, 10 seconds, 15, 20, each call stacking the argument that somewhere ahead a cylinder the diameter of a man's fist is thinking back at them and moving with intent. The sea resists the logic with randomness and sparkle, but the ship turns thought into weight, and weight into a line that can collide with a guess. On the U-boat, the lamp over the plotting table flickers as Chief Ritter slides his finger along the battery ammeter, then raps the bakelite housing once with his knuckle and watches the needle settle at a number he hates. 52 had looked like margin at dawn. At 14 meters with pumps throttled to the quietest trickle, it looks like a cliff that approaches as if pulled by rope. He whispers an order to reduce ventilation, another to shift 2 men from aft to midships to balance trim, and he can feel the exhalations in the boat thicken, can taste copper in the air from the sweat and the lead-acid breath of the cells. Neumann hovers at the scope, well like a man about to lean into winter wind. But he holds because Ritter wants minutes more before the next risk, because each second of quiet buys only the kind of safety that makes loud danger worse when it comes. Hale feels his eyes fight the glare salt sting. He blinks hard and forces focus into the pattern, not the pain. He keeps Maeve O'Rourke on the port bridge wing in his peripheral, her cap splotched darker where spray has soaked through, binoculars steadied by elbows, locked into the combing. She is calling the cadence with the plotter now, small corrections to keep bearings honest despite the ship's yaw into the swells. The ship's ASDIC officer shouts up a status that is mostly apology. The layer is in the way. The return is mush. The ship's wake throws a curtain that the ping must punch through and then tries to read its own echo. Hale acknowledges without looking. His world is a thin band of horizon and the lines he has drawn to make it less infinite. If he commits heavy, he spends charges that take him out of position and telegraph his hand. If he waits, whatever metal is out there will read the same sky and write a counterpoint. He chooses noise and motion over doubt. The destroyer's bow falls off a wave, shuddering as it buries to the anchor hawse, and in that lurch, Maeve sees it again. Not the flash this time, but the absence, a thin, unnatural absence. She calls it before she has her words perfect. Straight line, no crest behavior, a feather where no wave breaks, 10 degrees low on the port horizon. Steady. Hale rubs away an earlier mark and makes another, lower and slightly left, the lines on the repeater compass now making a funnel whose mouth remains stubbornly small. The funnel points not just to a spot, but to a velocity vector, and he feels the convoy behind him twist in his mind as the reported minefield veer begins. 10 degrees left over 5 minutes, a deliberate slow pivot that will drag his relative motion sideways and widen his error cone unless he anticipates it now. Below, Neumann can feel the ship above them without seeing it. Tension changes in the hull plates speak through his boots, the nuance each man learns after too many hours of listening. He orders, "Upscope, 2 seconds," and the team around him tightens into a coiled quiet, the periscope lifting with a sound so soft it seems only imagined. The head breaks the skin of the sea for as long as 2 slow heartbeats, and in one of those a sun slit pierces the overcast and runs a silver bead around the chipped edge where ice once took paint and left brass. As the ring retreats, a thin tongue of froth unscrolls down sea like a signature, and Neumann's mind flinches at the same time it hammers a bearing into his memory. He slams the scope down and says, "Dive planes 5 degrees down, Make depth 200. Not because going deep is safe, but because staying where the pings are strong is worse. Ritter's jaw tightens at the order. He had hoped to stay above the layer to conserve amps on planes and sail, to keep batteries from bleeding faster. 200 feet steals his margin and buys them refraction, scattering Aztec return in the cold band where sound bends away. He signals for silent running in earnest. No metal on metal, shoes off, whispers only, pumps to hand-driven if absolutely necessary. The fans that keep breath from turning sour thrum down to a whisper and then hover there, a more psychological comfort than medical. And he can feel the crew adjust their own lungs as if thrift in oxygen can be learned by will. The boat's speed drops to 3 knots, then 2. The propellers slow chew at the sea, a lullaby with a metronome's morale. He glances at the carbon dioxide scrubber canisters and calculates a window that is as much about fear as math. An hour at best before heads begin to throb and discipline begins to fray around the edges. On the bridge, another sunbreak sharpens the whitecaps into a million mirrors, each vying to be the one that lied to them. The randomness is its own pattern, a self-made clutter, and Hale instructs O'Rourke and the starboard lookout to adjust their sector sweep to 8-degree slices with 30-second delays, forcing their brains to reset and not glaze into acceptance. He feels the convoy's course change ripple through bearings. What was a steady drift now slants, and his thin lines frown. He adjusts their run to cut the new relative, leaning into a solution that will keep the target on their bow instead of their quarter. It costs him time to rim back into position afterward if the attack is wrong, but it keeps the accusation honest now. He orders depth charges set for a 2-stage spread, first at 50 feet for a splash fright, second at 150 where the top edge of a cold band might refract a ping and hide a hull. He is gambling that panic will produce motion, and motion is the real noise he can follow. The destroyer's siren barks action stations in short, animal cries that slice through the spray and the smell of oil. Hands run to rails and throw free the red-pinned drums, arming levers checked, safeties yanked so that a spring-fresh bomb is suddenly a thing that wants to kill. Hale cautions restraint and then orders the first pattern, a light one, a taste to check the palate of the sea. The stern lifts as they make speed. The water becomes slate and then firmer slate as the drums slip their rollers, red pins flashing and then vanishing as each cylinder tumbles into the swells with the disconcerting grace of a sporty child flipping into a pond. Each fuse set to go hot after a heartbeat or two, timed to the column of water they will pass through. Each depth an argument written down where pressure is the only witness. The boat hears it before the sea shows it. A rising series of throbs translated through water into hull, into bones, a harmonic that the crew can feel in their teeth fillings. Neumann's mind sees not the bombs, but the spaces between them, the geometry of a pattern and the habit of a destroyer commander trained to lay a curtain rather than aim a spear. He orders a tiny rudder input, starboard a degree, and eyes the inclinometer as the bow falls and the stern climbs into the dive he asked for. Ritter slides a hand to the plainsman's lever and rides the trim like a man controlling a frightened horse, every muscle trying to be the muscle of another man's hand. The first charges go, bloomers of pressure that slap the hull not as a punch, but as a shove, a sudden insistence that they belong somewhere else. Someone down the line coughs at the shock, and someone else clamps a hand over his mouth, as if the sea might hear that too. On the oscillograph upstairs, the Aztec trace is a bad radio station. The operator calls down range numbers with less and less confidence, and Hale acknowledges a ghost he cannot quite fix. He swings the stern after the first curtain, recircles to strafe his own wake, and knows he is making the water thick with bubbles that will lie for minutes and scatter the sound like ball bearings. He alters his plan. If the returns won't show him a hull, he will try to hear the men instead. He instructs the operator to switch to passive for a breath, to listen. The headset man leans in, closes eyes, and hunts not for an echo, but a sin. A pump, a loose spanner, the squeal of a bearing warmer than it should be. The sea is mostly its own voice, but within it he catches a tightness, a clot of sound that is not random. Not much, a tick that is almost not a tick, but it repeats with a period that a wave does not keep. Down where the light becomes idea rather than thing, Ritter feels the motors. He has trimmed them so fine that a child could count the armature's turns, but age is a truth that oil cannot disguise forever. One bearing, a middle bearing, the one he has been nursing, makes its small protest when the load is fractionally wrong. He could hide it at 4 knots, but 4 knots is a wish, not a speed they can afford. He signals for half a knot less, for the load to go to the other shaft, and for hell's sake, do not touch the bulkhead with the spanner when you do it. The change quiets the tick, but the time it takes to change is time when the tick was itself. And if someone above was listening instead of shouting, then the boat has just spoken its name. The convoy behind them begins its planned drift left, the minefield a rumor made into geometry across the ocean. Hale takes that into his head math, a moving target across his target, and knows that any solution he builds has to live under that larger motion, or it will be useless the moment he fires. He calls for the Hedgehog crew to stand by, the men at the spigot projectors locking the launchers to the forecastle deck, their hands moving over safety mechanisms that are both ritual and the thin line between machine and weapon. Hedgehog is a promise he would prefer not to make yet. It is precise and therefore demandingly honest. To waste one is to admit later that you became excited and threw darts at shadows. Neumann, at 200 feet and feeling the water thicken with temperature, makes his own hard promise. He asks Ritter for a silent turn under the layer, a wide, slow curve that will trade battery for geometry. The ideal, he knows, is to put the destroyer either exactly astern or exactly ahead. Most men like the beam when they're hunting, for the beam gives options. He picks astern, he orders, all ahead slow, rudder 10 to port, and then waits with the patience of a man watching paint dry under threat of fire. The boat lists so little that many aboard do not immediately sense the circle. Only the compasses creep. Only the bubbles along the hull shift their slide. He prays the layer will warp a ping, bend a line that expects a straight path, and in that curvature he can disappear into somebody else's math. The destroyer rides over its own noise, and in the brief passive window, the operator hisses the tick again, fainter now, but a hair out of place in the wash. It is on the bearing Hale's marks have predicted would be if a target chose to fall off to starboard beneath a cold cap. He knows how accidental it could be. He also knows how conspiratorial the world can seem when you want it to be. He divides the cache of truth he has. 2 glints timed to waves, a wake feather aging in his memory, a smear that moved like intent, the convoy's turn, the degraded returns, the tick. He can wait for the next sunbreak and beg for a 3rd glint, but the sky has thickened in a way that suggests withholding. He chooses criteria over cowardice. Ritter lowers his gaze to the CO2 indicator, reads the slight rise that doesn't yet hurt heads, and counts backwards from the decision he knows Neumann will have to make soon. How long to sit in the silent backward arc? How much battery for a sprint under the layer if they are ranged in by something clever? And when to risk the boat for air? He imagines the destroyer captain's options too, and in that thinking he hears footsteps on their own hull, phantoms of men who have not arrived, each passing minute making the arrival more likely. He holds the pumps where they are and quietly tells the cook to kill the hot plate where coffee was daring to be made. He is not superstitious, but he has known too many men who put a cup to their lips seconds before water tried to put steel there instead. Hale's helmsman calls out a yaw correction. The sea has thrown the bow half a point off. Hale corrects, lines closing on the repeater, and says the words that change the day. Hedgehog, stand by to fire in 1 minute. Aztec, give me a guide. Plot, mark bearing every 10 seconds. The bridge becomes its own machine, humans as cams and levers. O'Rourke wipes her cheeks with her sleeve without taking the binoculars from her face, salt lines left across the skin where the wind has drawn them. She wants the third glint for him. She wants it so she can see her own certainty reflected back. The sun denies her. She calls emptiness on the bearing, but she does not look away. The empty is instruction, too. Neumann hears the destroyer's change in voice through the hull, pitch of wake, tempo of strike, and pegs it to a threat he knows by rumor more than experience. Ahead-thrown projectors that do not waste their anger on water, that make no gesture unless they touch steel. He has no counter but to not be where geometry predicts he should. He orders rudder amidships, letting the arc start to end sooner than planned, and depth 230, sneaking below the proven scatter zone into colder, thicker code. Ritter's eyes say no before his voice can, because at 2:30 the cells will groan to hold the angle. But he nods when he sees the CO's eyes are not asking. He trims. He cheats weight with a finger on a valve that he will deny touching. He squeezes a few more trembling amps, and the boat slides down another bus length into the layer's deeper press. Above, the sonar trace, such as it is, twitches in a way that feels like a heartbeat rather than noise. The operator calls a range not as a fact, but as a suggestion. Short, somewhere under 300, which is both too close and perfect for Hedgehog, the weapon's small bombs arranged in a crown ahead of the bow, each a point on a negative constellation. Hale's lips press flat. He can feel the ship wanting the moment to be now. He knows the Hedgehog makes no noise that tells the target when to brace. No boil, no thunder, nothing until contact. It is surgical. It is merciless. It is also blind if placed wrong. The destroyer surges, her bow knifing clean as if the sea had thickened into something that can be carved and not resisted. The Hedgehog crew lines their spigots. 24 heads tilt up like cranes, ready to release ballast. The angle between math and hope narrows to a blade. Hale times the swell period against the cadence of the glints that were, sets his own internal metronome to it, and gives the order that leaves fingerprints he will feel tomorrow in his palm. Fire. The bombs sail on their silent parabolas, 24 black seeds against a ragged sky, and Hale tracks seconds in his head, eyes fixed where math says the U-boat must be. The Aztec trace is junked by their own prop wash, and the layers bend, a twitch of a needle that could be anything. And yet the geometry of the last glint and the stubborn feather says this is the patch to bet the convoy on. The destroyer rides up a swell and slams down. Spray sweeps the bridge windows. O'Rourke tastes salt and holds her breath because noise breeds doubt. They watch the water for answers. Hedgehog bombs only speak if they touch steel, and so the waiting is a kind of verdict. 3 seconds, 4, 5. Spray hissing off the forecastle rails. Hale leans forward as if distance will collapse into impact. The forward guns mute. The engine room telegraphs at full. The compass repeater marked with grease pencil scars converging on a moving maybe. 6 seconds, 7, a green swell rolls in, and then the line ahead remains unbroken. Silence is the wrong kind of thunder when you've thrown everything at a ghost that might be solid. Below, Neumann counts the same seconds by feel, the way men learn to count inside machines. The boat is trimmed down at 210 feet, the needles jiggling from the last shallow turn, the hull timbers murmuring. He wanted to be at periscope depth. He wanted the sea to lie to the destroyer. But Ritter had shaken his head at 48% battery, and the groan of the motors even at slow. They slid under the thermal seam, felt the water change temperature against steel, like stepping through a curtain, and he prayed the layer would bend sound while he tried to draw a circle that wouldn't intersect depth charges. The first of the Hedgehog bombs vanishes into the dark over them like stones tossed into a well. Men close their eyes anyway, fists clenched. A petty officer counts in a whisper until the counting becomes superstition, breath fogging in the chilled, stale air, the oxygen recirculation fan singing its thin note. Ritter taps a gauge with one finger and stops himself, because silence is more than sound. It is a kind of discipline, and metal on metal is a lesson learned in court-martials and funerals. The boat slides on at 3 knots, conserving, while carbon dioxide creeps in and muscles feel heavier. On the bridge, Hale absorbs the verdict and turns it into action rather than doubt. Come left 10, steer the wake line, hold speed 18. The convoy astern alters its stance like a school of fish, tiny in human eyes but significant in geometry. 10 degrees for a reported minefield patch, and with that, all the bearings written on the repeater are now history about to be wrong. O'Rourke repeats the new course, marks a fresh slash with grease that crosses out old truths. The Glint's bearing is now a relative moving target. If the submarine held onto the convoy's old course, it will be drifting to their starboard minute by minute, unseen but not unguessable. Complication stacks with the wind. The sun, which had been a shutter with mercy, opens a few misshapen slits across the clouds, and the sea throws 1,000 small lies back at them. White caps flare like broken glass. Rigging drips water that catches light and winks. O'Rourke makes her sweeps in 10-degree sectors just as taught. 7 hells 50 binoculars steady against a head that wants to turn faster, counting seconds and fighting the reflex to chase every spark. Her eyes water from spray and glare. She blinks once and curses herself. The memory of a pinprick on a gray ridge turns cruel when there are 100 pinpricks performing for the sun. Below, oxygen turns breath into labor, and Ritter does the arithmetic that makes choices hard. 46% battery now, the voltmeter sagging when both motors hum to hold 3 knots at depth. Ventilation is throttled to a whisper, the scrubbers pulling at the air like tired men, wringing a towel, and the boat is warm in some compartments and damp in others, condensation stitching drips that count time down the bulkheads. Ritter brings his mouth close to Neumann's ear and says the part no one wants to hear. At this rate, 60 minutes before we're past prudent. After that, air first, then power. The words change the shape of Neumann's next move. Surface, sprint, and die, or hold, starve, and hope the layer is a mask. Hale refuses to let the ocean's tricks be the last word. Set depth charges for 150 and 200. 2 patterns staggered, he says, because the layer must be made a trap rather than a shield. They had run the first pattern shallow, a test of presence. Now he wants to bracket the seam, hammer it so that the refraction that hides returns also produces a vertical drumbeat that can be heard. The Aztec man wipes his screen, a meaningless act except to restart his own patience, and the trace gives him a narrow spike that could be the U-boat's wake underlayer, could be turbulence, could be hope. O'Rourke sees something she hates to believe, a thin, straight line where no wave should lay straight, a small water feather that hangs beyond the swell's logic, and it points not at them, but just off the convoy's new course. The line holds longer than 10 seconds in a calm patch between foam tongues, unnaturally straight like a pencil mark drawn by a careful hand. She calls bearing, voice steady because training demands it, and the Polaris man repeats it down to the plotter, and Hale draws another line, sees the drift, and recognizes the periscope's intent, not to look any more, but to keep a sliver of metal up like a sighting stake, to ride the swell period, to stay with meat. Inside the U-boat, the periscope is down, yet the little head's wake betrays them. Neumann knows it. He can see the logic drawn in his mind, like Hale sees it on pencil and plastic. He had raised the scope bare seconds ago to sniff whether the destroyer had overrun them. In that fraction of a second, a chipped ring of bright brass, damaged by Baltic ice that winter, found a sun shaft at the wrong time, and now Every move is consequence. He orders a silent turn to starboard 10 degrees to align with where he guesses the convoy zig will land, to keep the periscope feather away from straight lines to the hunter that might be tracking those faint scars on the sea. The silent turn betrays them in a way only machines know how to betray. A single cavitation tick whispers up the water column as a blade encounters a microbubble at the wrong angle during the slow, careful rudder change. Ask Dick listeners live for those ticks. They are nervous system impulses in the noise. Hale's operator stiffens, just a hair, but he says, "Contact, faint, starboard 10, bearing drift consistent with target turning, range uncertain." Hale doesn't need certainty. He needs alignment. "Stand by, Hedgehog. One more throw. Ahead, full for the run. We're cutting across his circle." Ritter feels the tick, too, in the soles of his feet, or rather, he feels the men around him feel it, the way their eyes flick to the deck plating like the metal itself made a small complaint. He dials the motors down a hair to smooth the flow, but that hair is measured in oxygen minutes later. Everything is always trade. He slips a glance at the CO2 indicator, color pads that shift from safety to warning. And the hue tells him an hour is optimism. He hates optimism almost as much as he fears panic, and he tells Neumann quietly, "If the next pass is closer, we go still. Dead slow. Batteries off 5 minutes." The words are both salvation and suicide. Stillness means silence, but it also means sinking into the envelope where air is measured in size. The destroyer claws forward, the bow shivering as she hits 19 knots, and in that sprint, Hale remembers the rule of escorts: attack, then recircle, then reacquire, because speed outruns your ears. He is gambling that the geometry will carry him over the U-boat's chosen path in the narrow window before his Aztec goes blind again. The Hedgehog spigots are ready, the crew drilled to calm, the bombs perched like black doves waiting to be thrown. O'Rourke steals her gaze on the patch where the feather was, etching it into memory so that when the next wash of spray blinds her for 3 seconds, she can still see it in her mind. The risk is that they are chasing a memory, and memories don't explode. The hull's shadow on the U-boat's own sense of the world stretches into a groaning quiet as the destroyer's pressure wave passes overhead. The U-boat does not rock like a surface craft. It sways in slow argument with volume and gravity, and men feel that argument in their bones. The periscope stays down. Neumann clamps down on the urge to confirm, to look. The layer is above them, then around them, then above again, as the sea compresses and releases across small depths, a lens they cannot see but must trust. He hears the faint clatter of rivets in the destroyer's hull, singing through seawater as a memory of sound rather than a sound. He measures that memory against distance in a kind of sonar that is not the machine's. Hedgehog again sails. It is an odd, elegant violence, the ahead-throwing circle of ordnance arcing where the enemy will be, not where he was. Each bomb holds its silence like a promise. Contact fuses sleeping until they kiss steel. Hale's mind's eye traces them past the guessed line, ahead of the feather, into the space where a careful navigator would put himself if he were taking quick looks and turning under a thermal. If he is wrong, the bombs will vanish into deep, a miss that costs time and makes the convoy more naked behind them. If he is right, there will be no roar, just a hard metallic slam transmitted through the sea like a bullet through bone. On the U-boat, Ritter orders, all stop, 5 minutes, and every man listens to their own heart. In the new stillness, the sea's own small noises become crude and too loud, the trickle of condensation, someone's damp sleeve brushing oilcloth, the thin whine of the scrubber like a mosquito. The stillness carries them down a foot, then 2, trim changing slowly as frothing pockets around the hull settle. Neumann presses his teeth together to keep them from chattering from stress rather than cold. He imagines the Hedgehog bombs as seeds. He imagines them missing by yards, then by inches. and in that difference lives everyone he knows on the boat. Astic's screen gives a twitch that is not wishful thinking, a spike narrow as a nail, consistent with a slender target ahead of track. "Hold! Hold! Fire!" Hale orders, and the spigots punch in sequence, the deck jolting lightly with the release as black eggs leap. O'Rourke gasps without meaning to. She sees a gull cut across the track, an absurd white cross in a scene that is all steel and math, and for a flicker of a second, superstition flits through the crew like the shadow of a hand. The bombs disappear into the troughs ahead, into the color of slate, into the seam that hides and reveals in equal measures. The convoy astern is moved half a mile to the left of where it would have been 10 minutes ago. Tinny voices crackle over TBS with freighter masters reporting bearings to smoke they think they see, and the sea says they don't. Hale tunes it out. The picture he holds is smaller but sharper, the smear line, the bearing drift, the spike, the cavitation tick. He compresses hours of training and a morning of chase into this span between their own bow and water that might hold an enemy trying to be ocean. He swallows against a dry throat, and for a beat he is simply a man 50 feet above a set of guesses, responsible for the grain and mail, and men behind him who will not know this moment even existed. In the U-boat's bow compartment, a man thinks of his child's hair and then stops because breath is a ration. He saves the thought for when air is free again. Another man runs his thumb along a rosary bead and does not let it click. Ritter feels a bead of sweat creep down his spine and considers whether to turn the scrubber up a notch and decides no, because the whine will be louder and the numbers won't change enough. Neumann closes his eyes, the way a man tries to hear better when sight is useless, and hears his own gut under everything, the compressions of a big animal, the sea, moving around their steel bubble. If a Hedgehog bomb touches a U-boat, the sound travels through skin and bone before anyone can frame the idea. It is not thunder, it is a hammer on an anvil that a hammer was never meant to touch. The first impacts are none. Water takes them, embraces them, leaves the boat intact. The second pattern begins to reach depth, and Hale waits for the difference that is the only truth he trusts. On the bridge, O'Rourke cannot help but glance at the place where she first saw the speck that made all this inevitable, and she feels the strange intimacy of battle, that a fraction of a second could become hours. The sea rolls, breaks, reforms. The destroyer steadies her bow, and then the water ahead gives a small, unnatural leap, as if something just beneath it shrugged. For a heartbeat, there is a metallic clap that doesn't belong to wind or hull, transmitted through the destroyer's bones more than through air. Hale's hands are already moving to mark the spot, to commit to the follow-through that doctrine insists on. He has no visual proof, but the clap is real, and reality at sea is often a whisper that men must decide to believe loud. Neumann's world jerks, just a flick of motion without crash, a ripple through plate that makes teeth click. The Hedgehog that loved metal but only pecked it, grazed a plate or kissed a hydroplane, a glancing caress that writes a bruise rather than a wound. The effect is not fire, it is alarm. He opens his mouth to order a turn, to get out from under the curtain that is becoming a noose, and Ritter's hand is already on the wheel. The boat answers slow, because dead motors do not make sprinters. They trade stillness for motion, and with it, noise. Hale reads it like a story written in wavelets and sonar ticks. "He's moving. He has to," he says, and the gunner's mates are already setting the depth fuses to the new stagger, the rails clattering softly as weights roll to rails. The ocean gives them a small breath of sun. It stabs a shaft down through slate to pick out one indifferent spray burst, and in that flare, O'Rourke catches the most honest thing she will see all day. An ellipse of darker water surfacing, a wheeze of trapped air that belongs to a machine, not a wave. It is there and gone, but once you've seen it, You can't unsee the pattern. Bearing constant, she calls, and it is the last permission Hale needs. Below, Ritter watches the battery needle kiss 42% and thinks of the long slide behind that number to 30, then to the time when men stop making jokes. He knows another run like the last will strip another few points just fighting the water, that the option to go deep and dead is still there, but will become less rational with every tick of the CO2 pads toward gray-green. Neumann's jaw tightens. Rudder 15 to port. Make for the Convoy's shadow, he says, playing his last card. If the surface ships must stay with their charges, the shadow corridor might be a thread they can ride to life. Hale anticipates it. The shadow is the refuge every hunted thing runs for. Cut him off the shadow, he orders. Pattern 3, drop on my mark. The destroyer heels, the screws bite, and the wake roars away into a froth that will dirty their own sonar for the next turn. He hates that, but he hates losing more. The charges roll, safety pins flashing red once as they tumble, and the ocean swallows consequences on whatever depth is the right one. The escort's bow lifts as if to see better, the horizon tilts, and the men hold to rail and doctrine and the way their XO's voice falls in the moment before a result. The first of the charges detonates deep enough to rattle china in the wardroom and make men catch their balance, far enough below the layer to make a boom more felt than heard. The second, at the higher fuse setting, goes off in that smear where the layer ends and the colder water begins, and it comes through as a double beat that confuses the ears. Hale feels the pattern more than hears it. He sees the drumbeat he ordered playing out in water. He imagines U-boat plates oil canning, rivets screaming, things that break a boat's will before they break its back. He draws a breath he doesn't remember starting and waits for what the sea will show him as truth. The U-boat shudders at the second detonation. It is not death. It is a punch that makes light bulbs dim, a metallic groan that runs across frames and makes gauges twitch. Some men make small involuntary sounds and pretend they did not. One steam pipe blows a tiny whistle where a clamp shifts a millimeter, a sound like a kettle that is a disaster in a quiet boat. Ritter slaps a hand over the leak and shoves a wedge into place without a word. Neumann feels the boat's bow wanting to rise with the shock's bounce and forces himself to hold it down without throwing in too much ballast, because you cannot argue with water when it is still angry. On the bridge, a bruise of oil and something darker begins to fingerprint the surface, no bigger than a dinner table at first, spreading thin, iridescent, almost imaginary if you didn't know what to look for. O'Rourke sees it and points without speaking, because calling it feels like hubris. Hale sees it and does not let himself decide what it means yet. Oil comes from many places in a warship, a submarine, a sea filled with lost toys. But the timing and the place are compelling. He lifts the voice pipe and gives the order he has been husbanding since the first glint. Hold the convoy's new course. We will finish here. Ritter marks the small changes that mean a wound you can live with for a while. A slow weeping from a flange aft, a smell of hot copper that wasn't in the air an hour ago. A new stiffness in the handwheel for the dive planes that makes the helmsman use his shoulder. He glances at the battery again and decides not to tell Neumann the number, because knowledge now would not change command's calculus, only make it heavier. He thinks of surfacing into wind and guns and white water. He thinks of staying and letting men sleep one at a time for 30 seconds to steal breath. He thinks of how very loud a periscope's small chip can be when the sun chooses to kiss it. The destroyer eases off the sprint, circling to keep their quarry in a small shrinking box, a shepherd dog carving the sea into squares. The sun shuts its shutters again, and with that merciful gray, the world loses its lies. Only real things remain to see and hear. Hale uses the gray like an ally. "Ask Dick. Listen," he says simply, and the operator leans in and finds, under their own wake's echoes, a single traveling sound like a tired heart. The bearing is steady. The sea has given him a thread that isn't sparkle or guess. In the boat, men's lungs are sore. The urge to cough becomes a monster, and discipline is the rope around its throat. Neumann runs his hand along the periscope housing, feeling the tiny roughness where paint went missing to ice, where the metal that betrayed them still gleams in his head. He wants to smash it with a wrench, and doesn't. "Another 5 degrees port," he whispers, as if the sea can be bargained with softly. Then we hold. He calculates his own small circle within the destroyer's larger one and hopes angles can be prayers. Hale signals one more depth charge pattern, 10 charges, staggered, the second beat timed to the layer that has been both refuge and curse. He thinks of the minefield report and how the convoy will look on the far side of it, intact or with a hole. He thinks of wasted ordnance and how many times the sea has let ghosts eat explosives without belching truth back. But he has, finally, more than a glint. He has a feather, a tick, a spike, a stain, and a stubborn line that refuses to wander like a wave. He nods. The charges roll, the sea receives. The ocean's reply is not immediate. It never is, not in a way that cares about human pacing. But then the water lifts in a slow breath, a bubble swell rising that is not a swell, and a hiss like soda uncapped slides along the surface. The smell comes last, oil, old and cutting, undeniable upwind. O'Rourke says nothing and smiles into the wind without joy. Hale's shoulders drop, and then square again. There is procedure in victory, too. He keeps them on station as the stain widens, as pieces of things that were not water.